How would you know if a god was displeased? The Egyptians did not imagine thunderbolts falling from the sky, nor sudden flames consuming the careless. Displeasure was quieter, more intimate, woven into the fabric of daily life. It was not destruction, it was disturbance. The first signs were often in the body: a restless night, a dream that lingered, a sudden unease in the stomach after an ordinary meal. To us, these might feel like a chance or fatigue, but to the Egyptians, they were potential signals: a dream of falling, of wandering lost, of speaking but no sound emerging. These were not ignored. They were carried to a wise person, retold carefully, parsed for meaning. Dreams were messages, sometimes muddled, sometimes sharp, and a troubled dream could be the echo of a misstep. Then, there were the small misfortunes of daily rhythm: a jar of beer spoiled before its time, a loom thread snapping again and again, no matter how carefully it was rewoven, a child's sudden fever that lifted just as suddenly. These were not disasters, but patterns. They whispered that something had shifted, that balance had been nudged off its line. Animals too were messengers: cats staring intently at the blank wall, dogs refusing food, birds turning circles in unusual ways above the courtyard. These were not random quirks. They were interpreted as signs that the unseen world was stirring. If the gods were near, their signals were near as well. Sometimes, the signs were social: a promise broken, a quarrel left unresolved, a word spoken in anger that refused to settle. Egyptians believed Ma'at lived not only in temples but in relationships: discord between neighbors, tension within families, the quiet fracture of community could all be read as signs that the gods were displeased. For to live out of harmony with one another was to live out of harmony with Ma'at itself. When such signs arose, people did not panic. They observed, they reflected, and then they sought guidance. A priest might be consulted, not as an accuser, but as an interpreter. He would listen to the dream, examine the misfortune, consider the pattern. He might suggest a small offering: incense, bread, and beer, or a prayer spoken at dawn. Sometimes, a ritual of purification: washing with natron, lighting a lamp, sweeping a threshold. These were not punishments but realignments. The signs of displeasure were not meant to terrify, they were meant to remind. They were gentle nudges, telling the soul something is uneven, something needs attending. To notice was already the first step towards repair. Imagine a woman whose weaving falls again and again, the threads tangling no matter her care. She begins to suspect it is not her skill, but a sign. She visits the temple, tells her story. The priest nods, sprinkles water for purification, and tells her to light incense at her household shrine, to whisper a prayer of apology for any word she has spoken too sharply, any gesture she had forgotten. She returns home, follows the advice, and the next day her loom runs smooth. The gods have not punished, they have reminded, and she has listened. The Egyptians did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. A spoiled jar of beer was not just spoiled, it could be an echo of something larger. A child's nightmare was not dismissed, it was honored as a possible message. To live in Egypt was to live alert to these signs, not with fear, but with attentiveness, like a gardener watching the tilt of each plant, the quality of each leaf. And once the signs were seen, what then? How did you make things right again? The Egyptians had rituals for this, not grand terrifying sacrifices, but small steady gestures. Bread placed on an altar, incense rising in smoke, a confession whispered into the air. In the next part, we'll step into those rituals of making right and see how balance was restored. When a misstep had been noticed, a dream unsettled, a promise broken, a silence where words of courtesy should have been, the next step was not despair but action. The Egyptians lived with the belief that balance could be restored, that Ma'at was not a brittle line but a thread that would be rewoven if tended with care. The rituals of making right were not dramatic. They were measured, simple, and meant to ease both the god and human back into harmony. The most common gesture was offering bread, beer, incense, the essentials of life given back to the gods who had provided them. A person might take a small loaf, set it on the household shrine, and whisper an apology for words spoken too harshly, for promises forgotten, for the day's imbalance. The act was both symbolic and real. Bread for nourishment. To give it away was to show seriousness. To say, I return what sustains me, because I know I depend on you. Beer too was offered, poured into bowls or onto earth, the sweet scent rising as a reminder that joy could be shared. Incense was lit, its smoke curling upward like words carried to unseen ears. Even a single cone of resin, small and smoldering, was enough. What mattered was not the size of the gift, but the sincerity of the act. There were spoken elements as well, confessions not shouted, not proclaimed, but whispered into the air. I did not mean to offend. I have forgotten, and I asked to be remembered. I set myself back in order. These were not admissions of guilt in the way later traditions would imagine, but alignments. Words meant to straighten what had bent, just as the negative confessions in the afterlife set the soul against falsehood. So these small, living confessions set daily life back against truth. Community often played a role. A misstep that touched others was not repaired alone. A broken oath might be confessed before neighbors. A quarrel might be mended with witnesses present. The ritual then was both social and sacred, reminding everyone that balance was not personal only, but shared. To live in Ma'at was to live in harmony with both gods and people, and repair meant reaching in both directions. Priests could guide the process. In temples, there were formal rites of purification. Water drawn from the Nile, mixed with natron, sprinkled on hands and heads. Sometimes, words from the Book of the Dead were adapted for the living. Invocations of purity, pleas for balance. The priest might wave incense, chant a line, or mark the ground with gesture. But just as often, the repair happened at home, with a candle, a loaf, a whispered prayer. The accessibility of it mattered. Balance was not the property of temples alone. It was a rhythm every household could tend. One beautiful detail appears in fragments of text, the closing formula. After offerings and words were made, it was common to say, "It is restored," short, simple, final. A way of drawing a line under the act, a signaling to both self and divine that the disharmony has ended and balance was back in place. And how did people feel afterward? Relief? Yes, but also belonging. To repair was to step back into the flow of life, to move again with the river, not against it. The misstep was not erased. It had been acknowledged, but it no longer weighed. It was like smoothing a wrinkle from linen, like setting a jar upright after it tipped. Life continued, steadier than before. And once balance was restored, there was joy. Festivals and processions, music and color, reminded people that the gods were not distant tyrants but neighbors, companions in celebration. To see the repair was to see the return of belonging, and that is where we turn next, into the festivals, the songs, and the scent of incense carried through the streets.